My name is Charles Byrne, and I come from a race of giants who lived and yet live today in that part of the north of Ireland famous for its Giant's Causeway.
He really did want to be buried at sea. There's something tragic about him being exhibited like this, so much against his own will. I think we should respect the Irish giant's desire to be buried and not to be on exhibit.
When we were redisplaying the museum in 2005, we did think about whether we should remove the skeleton from display. In the end, we decided it ought to remain on display as part of the collection.
After a great deal of thought, our proposal is that his wishes should be respected. His story has never been properly ended, and I think the best way to properly end it is to bury him at sea.
We've read the BMJ paper with interest. It's an unusually eloquent request, and it's very well measured and well argued. The Board of Trustees of the Hunterian Collection take very seriously their role in ensuring that the Royal College of Surgeons treats with care and respect the collection that came to them from John Hunter in 1799.
By the time I reached my 20th year, I was around 8 feet tall, and I suffered the terrible problems and pains we giants are prone to.
Here in this Charing Cross area of London, Charles Byrne spent the last 2 years of his troubled life. Now, he passed away on this very site to my left, where the tree sits. He's found his way to Cockspur Street in Charing Cross, that's where he's living, and this is his London. He had been exhibiting himself just over here at Haymarket. You can view the Irish giant for a good 8 hours a day, with maybe a little hour break for Charles Byrne to relax.
The Morning Herald and Daily Advertiser, Wednesday, April the 23rd, 1783. Irish giant. This astonishing colossus is but 22 years of age and measures upwards of 8 feet 2 inches in height. Nor does that size, however amazing, afford less satisfaction to the spectator than his exact proportion in every respect. Admittance 2 and 6. Children and servants 1 shilling.
Byrne's making a lot of money as a very popular human curiosity. Given that he came from Irish peasant stock, he's enormously wealthy.
So we have a man who was a peasant, but he obviously worked very hard to make something of himself.
Yeah, we say he had a fortune. The upper limit of that would hit at least a good £700. Byrne is drinking in the Black Horse when something very significant happens. He's pickpocketed with his £700 on his person. He loses his money. He's in pain. He becomes, one can imagine, depressed.
London was the home of a new kind of surgeon. These men knew I would die soon. They longed for my body, and they were in league with grave robbers. Their leader was John Hunter. I feared him greatly.
In the background, while this is going on, John Hunter, the famous surgeon, is keeping an eye on things, and he's aware that this ailing celebrity doesn't have long.
Not only John Hunter, everyone in that field wanted to get his body.
One of the major newspapers of the time describes this situation. The journalist says the surgeons are surrounding Byrne's house like harpooners surrounding a whale. And a month later, poor Charles has passed away. The surgical establishment want his corpse. 1 or 2 shady characters switched Byrne's corpse for dead weight. And the coffin that was buried at sea did not contain Byrne. It's some 4 years before it comes out that John Hunter has the corpse.
There is no doubt, it seems, that John Hunter acquired the skeleton by means that we would not condone today. There is no doubt that John Hunter boiled up the remains.
I think John Hunter was one of the greatest scientists and contributors to medical science who ever lived. It's doubtful that surgery would have developed as quickly as it did scientifically had it not been for him. However, that has nothing whatsoever to do with, in my view, his willingness to so blatantly ignore the desperate, desperate wishes of a dying man not to fall into his hands and be either dissected, boiled down, or in any other way desecrated by him.
I came to the museum with one of the patients, Brendan Holland, who was treated by Professor Besser in the 1970s. And I would like to ask him to give you his view on this disease. Brendan.
Thank you, Martha. As someone who was more fortunate than Charles Byrne, I am alive to relate and tell you about my experience. This is me at time of diagnosis in St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And this is me aged 38 years, so this is 18 years later, and these are my hands compared to someone of normal stature. Our understanding of this genetic condition has only recently been heightened due to the groundbreaking research by Professor Corbinitz and her team. This work has helped us all to see that we have been numbered among our ancestors as both sufferers and carriers of the rogue gene.
There is a gene which has been identified in some of these families having a change, what we call a mutation, which can cause the disease.
Yes.
We had your sample and we had the test done and we found a change in this gene called AIP.
Right.
And we think that this change gives people who carry this change a predisposition to develop a pituitary tumor,
Right.
which in your case indeed happened.
Yes, of course.
And I wonder if you know anybody else in your family has a similar condition.
Yes, I have a distant cousin who suffers from the same condition. She's now in her 20s.
The fact that you have a distant relative with disease and the fact that we did find a change in your gene suggests that maybe other people in your family also carry this gene.
In my lifetime, I did not know the cause of my condition, which it seems lay deep in the centre of my brain. They took 2 of my teeth, and I now know that my race shares a common secret.
So what is the cause of acromegaly? It's usually a pituitary tumor. We took the skull to the Natural History Museum, where there is a machine called a microcomputer tomograph. We made these images from the skull using this machine, and you see the characteristic features of the very thick bones, the very long jawbone here, and the quite prominent eyebrows and the huge frontal sinus here. All this area I'm showing you here is the frontal sinuses of the patient, very typical with acromegaly. And here you can see the bony fossa where the pituitary tumor was sitting, and it's quite large. This patient had gigantism due to a large pituitary adenoma. We identified a mutation in his DNA from actually 2 different tooth samples. We found a few more families, also from Northern Ireland, and also having exactly the same mutation.
In the late 1700s, there was a quarry of white limestone, most unusual in Northern Ireland. And as the quarry was being mined, the face of it regressed towards a cemetery. So they undercut the cemetery. And lo and behold, outpoured a number of bones and skeletons, some of which were of huge stature. There were also detailed descriptions of the long bones of the body. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was in a graveyard within 3 to 4 miles of where Charles Byrne grew up. Personally, I find the revelation that the condition is genetic a source of great comfort, in a strange way.
We've just been involved ourselves in writing a paper partly about the fear of dissection, which concerns Charles Byrne. In fact, this is it's quite moving for me. This is the first time I've seen his skeleton. I mean, this was a very courageous man who was noted at the time as being polite, a gentleman, dressed like a gentleman. And when I read this, how can someone who sees the skeleton and reads this understand that? It says here that he was a popular source of entertainment. Actually, people were not just entertained by him, they were impressed with him. the only quote about him is that someone described him as a quotes unquote ill-bred, disagreeable beast. Well, that's not how most people described him. And quite honestly, I don't understand how people can come and look at the skeleton and read this and really have any idea of the background that makes me feel so uncomfortable about the continued display of the skeleton.
There have been some major legal changes recently. We had some massive organ retention scandals at Bristol and Alderhay, and this is an area that there was a lot of debate around anyway, the sort of what the law should say and do regarding the human body. But these issues culminated in a piece of legislation, the Human Tissue Act 2004, and that foregrounded the element of consent as regards what can be done with the human body. So consent, a person's consent becomes a cornerstone as to what can be done with their body in terms of human tissue, organ donation. And this is an area that overlaps with issues surrounding Charles Byrne.
What is interesting about the Human Tissue Act is that there is a criminal penalty associated with not taking my choices and seriously, or the rejection of any medical wish to use my body in a particular way after I die seriously. With burial, even though we very strongly believe that we have a right to be buried in the way that we wish to be or cremated in the way that we wish to be, that same legal obligation is not there. What is there, debatably, is a very strong moral obligation. So when we talk about the law in relation to these kinds of issues, we need to always keep in mind the difference between what is legal on the one hand and what is moral on the other.
We cannot impose today's moral judgment on what happened 50 years ago, nor can we impose our moral judgment on decisions made by Hunter, which I admit were for his own ends. But in his view, and Hunter's view is important in all of this, it was for the common good. It was for the further understanding of why people had these extraordinary shapes. Whilst Byrne may have had expressed his wishes orally or verbally to his friends, what would his view be if he knew what we know now? I'm sure, as I would be, to stand in that glass case for the next 250 years. His body has yielded us some vital information in the understanding of the genetic relationship and the genetic nature of this condition.
What troubles me about the display simply is that, having dwelt upon the story and spent time psychologically with Charles Byrne, if you like, that's
you
a very...
You have no idea what Charles Byrne went through, Thomas, with respect.
I'm sure I don't.
None.
I can't get beyond what happened in terms of how his body was procured and how his burial instructions have been contravened. I can respect hugely the brilliant work that's been done, but I can't find an argument in that to justify the display.
Well, I'll give you one. If he had been made available to him, the care and the consideration that today we are given, because he's given his body for medical understanding, then he would almost certainly agree with my view that this is the right thing to do today.
Well, the Board of Trustees welcome the chance to engage with serious, measured and well-argued debate around what to do with Charles Byrne's remains. They have considered it very seriously every time there's been a legitimate request to consider the way that they're treated. In particular, the board thought very carefully in the lead up to the refurbishment of the museum in 2005, which of course was the same time as the Human Tissue Act, which came into force in 2006. So the board thought very carefully at that stage whether to respect Charles Byrne's likely wishes and to rebury him, whether to remove the remains from on display and keep them simply and only for research and storage behind the scenes. And they considered that the benefit of keeping Charles Byrne's remains on display outweighed the merits of, after 2 centuries, finally respecting his likely wishes. Techniques continue to develop. We couldn't have anticipated being able to do what Professor Corbinitz and her team did to the remains even 10 or 15 years ago. And all this makes now a particularly exciting time to have custody of a really important, really well diagnosed, really well described collection of pathological remains.
So family members can be screened for the mutation, and the carriers can have clinical follow-up and can lead to early diagnosis to the disease, which is inevitable that it will be a better outcome. All these patients you see in yellow have been screened, been cleared of the disease, except the ones who were actually found to have the disease. They didn't know they have the disease. The only reason we found the disease because they went to the doctor due to their genetic status. And what we hope that screening the other families, we will avoid the children to be ill or to grow to be a giant. And that's probably the most important outcome of all this research.
Our view that he should be buried despite that good really relates to the fact that there are a lot more people now who have this disease, who could volunteer, and I have no doubt would volunteer, for medical research that would enable people with this disease to lead better lives than they otherwise would. So it's in that sense that I suspect Byrne would conclude that, well, I would still like to be buried and have my wishes honored.